This presentation will review the variety of direct observation methods that can be used to assess the academic environment and student behavior in the classroom. The goals of direct observation are to verify information from teacher reports. So this is the information that you gathered through teacher interviews or possibly from rating scales. Now you're going to actually go in the classroom and see the consistency or what's really happening. Also, you're going to gather data on student-teacher interactions in the natural environment. So you'll be able to see really what the teacher does, what the student does, how the teacher responds to the student's behavior, and how the student responds to the teacher's behavior. Also, you'll be collecting data on variables that will give you an idea of approximately how much time the student is spending being actually engaged in academic work. So how many opportunities to respond to academic stimuli are they being presented with, and what are they doing with those opportunities? Are they engaging? Are they off task? Before you go in to conduct an observation, you want to have an idea of what to expect. So you would want to have talked with the teacher about the classroom rules, the planned activities during the time period in which you're going to observe, the structure of the classroom. Make sure you're going in at a time that's appropriate. So if we're concerned about a student's writing performance, that we're going to the class at a time when they'll be expected to write. When scheduling your observations, you often might think about how often do I need to go. And with behavior, we know that behavior data are more variable than academic performance data. So you want to make sure that you get in there until you have a fairly consistent data set that seems to be representative of the behavior. And also in your observations, you want to make sure you look at a peer comparison. So prior to the session, you might talk with the teacher and say, who is an average performing peer? Whose behavior can you look to see what's typically expected, what's an acceptable representation of the behavior the teacher is looking for in the classroom. So good observers are stealthy. You're in the back of the room, you're discreet, you're not letting the target student know that you're there to see them. And a big part of this also involves limiting interactions with students. I've been into classrooms before with little kids who want to know what you're doing, and they're looking at if you have a clipboard and paper, and will try to engage you. And although they're cute and you want to be nice, you really have to act like you're very important and busy and cannot engage with them to collect the best data. So the idea is for you to become invisible and for the students really to behave the way they would if you weren't there. So in other words, we're trying to avoid any reactivity. In the following slides, we will review each of the following 4 commonly used observational strategies: narrative recording, interval recording, momentary time sampling, and event recording. Narrative recording really involves going in, observing the student's behavior, and recording everything you see. So it's a play-by-play of the behavior in the natural setting. You're capturing what the student does, how peers respond to it, how the teacher responds to it, what's going on with instruction, and it does give you this comprehensive picture of what's going on. Some advantages to the use of narrative recording include that it provides a record of the child's behavior and the observer's impressions. You're writing down everything you see as you see it. This type of recording also maintains the original sequence of behavior, so you can go back and do an analysis to see what the antecedents and consequences are for each target behavior. Finally, the narrative recording sets the stage for more specific and quantifiable observations. If a teacher tells me in an interview that a problem is the students often off task and disrespectful, and I go in and observe, I may be able to operationally define what the teacher means by being disrespectful, which may be talking out in class, using inappropriate language, and then I could go in and use a more quantifiable approach to document those behaviors. Some disadvantages: the narrative recording itself is not quantifiable, so there really isn't a system to compare data from one day to another. And in that similar manner, we're not going to be able to validate or check reliability on that. And it can be a really demanding task for the observer, if you think about it, to sit there and watch a child and try to record and capture everything that's going on in the classroom. In time sampling or interval recording, we take a larger observation period or session and divide it into smaller intervals. Then we watch for behavior and record behavior within these more limited time intervals. So for example, I may go into a classroom and observe for 20 minutes, but I divide that 20 minutes into 15-second intervals. And there are different types of interval recording called whole interval and partial interval and momentary time sampling. For partial interval recording, you're noting if the behavior occurs at any time during the interval. So in the previous example I described, I was going into the classroom to observe for 20 minutes, and I broke that 20-minute observation session into 15-second intervals. If I were using partial interval recording, if the behavior occurred at any time during a 15-second interval, I would mark it. So if I were observing for off-task verbal behavior, calling out, if at any point during my interval the student displayed that behavior, I would mark it. For whole interval recording, we would mark the behavior only if it occurs for the entire duration of the interval. So it would occur for the entire 15 seconds. Then we would mark it. And in momentary time sampling, we only record the behavior as occurring if it happens at the moment an interval begins or ends. So typically when you do a direct observation using interval recording, you're going to have some kind of cueing system. So it may be an audio tape where you wear a headphone and it beeps at the start of every interval. There's also an electronic device called a motivator that will vibrate according to set intervals that you program. So right when that beep occurs or a motivator shakes, that will be your cue. You look at the student, and if they were displaying that target behavior, it will be recorded. Some advantages of using interval recording are that it allows for a large number of observations in a short amount of time. So we get a better sample of the student behavior. It also structures your observation. So you're looking for specific target behaviors and you have a systematic way of recording them. It also facilitates checking reliability. So if I have a good operational definition of what my behavior is that I'm looking for and my system planned out, so 15-second partial interval recording, I should be able to go in and observe with a co-observer, and we both end up with the same data at the end of the session. It's also applicable to a wide range of behaviors. So here we're looking at any behavior that we can observe and create an operational definition for. We can do interval recording to generate data used to monitor that behavior. Some disadvantages: interval recording doesn't provide information about the quality of the behavior. We're really recording whether it happened or not, but we're not getting things about the intensity of the behavior. Also, whole interval data collection may underestimate the occurrence of behavior. So again, in whole interval recording, the behavior has to occur for the entire duration of the interval before we record it. So if a student were talking out for 13 of the 15 seconds in the interval, it would not be recorded because they weren't displaying that behavior for the entire interval. So in that way, it may underestimate the occurrence of behavior. On the other hand, partial interval may overestimate the occurrence of behavior. So here, the behavior only has to occur for 1 second out of the 15 seconds in the interval, and we're going to record it. So that may overestimate the behavior. Momentary time sampling also has some advantages. It's time-saving and convenient. I'm only looking up and monitoring the behavior for that split second at the start or end of the interval. Also, it can be useful for multiple behaviors and/or children. So, for example, since I'm only looking at the behavior at the very start of the interval, if there were 3 students in the classroom who I were interested in, once my tape beeps, I could look student 1, student 2, student 3, and quickly record their behavior, and then wait for the start of the next interval. Beep, student 1, student 2, student 3. Similarly, I could look at a variety of behaviors. So I could go down a checklist. So at the very start of the interval, I'd look, are they on task? Are they verbally disruptive? Are they disruptive motor? And record those behaviors. Like interval recording, momentary time sampling is applicable to behaviors without clear-cut beginning or ends. So for both interval recording and momentary time sampling, we can look at behaviors like engagement, in which we know students are kind of in and out of engagement. It would be hard to come up with a definition and monitor when that begins and when that ends, when they're looking at the teacher and now they looked away and now they looked back. As compared to whole and partial interval recording, momentary time sampling has the least bias. That is, the least likely to overestimate or underestimate the occurrence of the behavior. Some disadvantages: since you're not really observing the behavior the whole time during the session, you may miss the occurrence of briefer, rarer behaviors. And you lose some of the continuity of behavior because we're just recording at the start of the interval and then really kind of ignoring everything else that happens for the following seconds and then picking back up. When reporting the results from momentary time sampling and interval recording, it's important to understand that it is not an estimate of time that the behavior would recur. So we don't want to report that the behavior occurred for a blank percentage of the time. That would be inaccurate. It is an estimate of what percent of intervals in which the student displayed the target behavior. So we would report that the student displayed engagement behaviors, off-task verbal behaviors for whatever percentage of the observed intervals. So at the end of the session, if you've observed 100 intervals and the student displayed off-task behavior in 20 of them, we would say the student displayed off-task behavior for 20% of the observed intervals. These forms of data collection are not precise enough to say the student was engaged for 50 minutes or for 10 minutes out of a 20-minute session, so they were engaged 50% of the time. That's too specific and a misrepresentation of the type of data that you've collected. Behavior can also be assessed through event recording, and there are several different types of event recording procedures. So first is duration recording, and here we're just really recording how long the behavior occurs. So for example, if a child were tantruming, we could start the timer when they started their tantrum and record how long the tantrums were lasting. We can do frequency recording, which is just noting how often the behavior occurs in a given observation period. So just doing a tally mark of hand raises or call outs. And then there's latency recording, and this is how long it takes for a student to initiate an appropriate response or behavior following a prompt for instruction. So the teacher tells the student to take out their book, you start the timer, and wait, and then record when the student actually takes out the materials. Some advantages of event recording include that it can be used to detect behaviors with low rates. So some problem behaviors I might not be able to catch if you just go in on a given day and observe for 20 minutes in the classroom. So a teacher may keep a frequency count of those behaviors across a week or each day. It also gets at specific characteristics of responses. So things like duration and frequency are not estimated through interval or momentary time sampling recording, but can be captured through event recording. It also can be used to provide information about changes in behavior over time. So we can look for the time, the length, the duration of tantrums, say, to decrease over time, or the amount of time it takes between when a student gets an instruction and they initiate compliance with that instruction. We can try to shrink that time. Some disadvantages: you are looking for responses here that have a clear-cut beginning and end. So when we talked about interval and momentary time sampling recording, those are appropriate when your behaviors don't necessarily have a clear-cut beginning and end, like on-task behavior or off-task behavior. But here, to record the frequency of a behavior, we want to say that was the behavior and now it's over. That's one occurrence. And then when to know when another occurrence begins, and that should be recorded. Does not necessarily reveal sequences or temporal patterns. So if you have a teacher collect a frequency count at the end of the week, you have your frequency count. If you're collecting duration recording, it'll tell you how long that lasts, but it's just going to give you a number, not describing the context for that behavior. And observers must maintain attention over longer periods of time. So if we talk about someone maintaining a frequency count all week, they're going to be looking for that behavior all the time. Whereas when you do, say, an interval recording, you go in and you carefully observe for a smaller segment of time.